Thank you so much. Thank you so much for having me here today. It's always, I've been doing these online lectures over the past couple of years now, and it's always interesting. I can't see anyone's faces. It's hard to gauge what my audience is doing or thinking. But on the other hand, it's such a pleasure to be able to connect with people from all around the world. And that is something I've really come to appreciate. So today I'm going to my talk is called Family History, Memory, Notes on Some Jewish Graphic Novels. I'm going to give you a little background about myself. And I was very ambitious with this talk. I suggested 4 books that I would give some notes on. But actually, I found that it will be more interesting, perhaps, to my audience if I narrowed in on 2 of those books, which are Rutu Modan's The Property and Nora Krug's Belonging. And then, of course, we can talk about more of the books in the Q&A. So I want to just start with my background. So I am a scholar of comics, which is actually less unusual than it was when I was working on my dissertation. So I started off as a literature scholar. And then I found that I was really interested, I was studying memoir. So how people come to tell the stories about themselves. And that's something that my first book, which was based on my dissertation, is very much invested in. When I went to graduate school, I thought I was going to write about prose, literature and prose. Actually, all the books behind me, that's my prose fiction shelf. But what I found in graduate school, I discovered, or really rediscovered, because I'd read Mouse as a young child, or an almost teenager, I rediscovered a really serious interest in the visual image and in the visual image as it relates to memoir. It's not just the visual image that becomes really important when we think and talk about autobiography and the stories people tell about themselves. It's also images that are written as words. So if you think about memory and those moments that sort of stand out in your mind and help you really think about the stories we tell about ourselves, the stories we share with others, often they begin or they open with a strong image. That's a quality that you find in a lot of prose memoirs. And eventually I found myself really connecting to graphic memoirs. So the term I'm going to use today, graphic memoirs, is, it's a term that I use for long form comics. So comics is a medium, it's a mode, it's a way of telling stories involving usually images and words. It's best not to think about comics as the words and the images as operating separately. In fact, one of the most important things, if there's any takeaway from my talk today, is that comics has a grammar all of its own, and the images and the words really speak to each other. And I think you'll see this in both Rutu Modan's work, which is fiction, so it's actually a graphic novel, and in Nora Krug's work, which is memoir and is very, very different. So the 2 styles I'm going to focus on today are very different. So in the book that I wrote, I actually didn't write about Modan or Krug. Krug's book hadn't come out yet. I was writing about Jewish American identity. So I was focused on books that were written by women. I was interested in the perspective of women in the book I was writing, and how really we come to see ourselves in large part through not just the stories we tell about ourselves over time, our personal history, our own memories, but also the collective narratives that are often told about us. So I was very enthusiastic, as you can see with the epigraphs in my book. But I think they really tell the story of my book in many ways. And especially that line from Aileen Kaminsky-Crumb, who's the first cartoonist I talk about in my book, where she says, "I always start with the nose, that's all I know." So she's an autobiographical cartoonist who draws herself in her comics. Her comics are really rich. We're not going to talk about them today, but I was really interested in this conversation in which she talked about how the first thing she did when she would draw the image of herself on the page was she would draw her nose. And in this conversation, actually, that took place at the University of Chicago about almost 10 years ago now, it was a panel of cartoonists, all autobiographical cartoonists, many of them women. And what ended up really coming across was how all of them had this physical detail around which their own characterization of themselves often hinged. In other words, the no's came to represent some aspect of themselves. Partly, oftentimes, it was something about themselves that they wished to sort of push away. But what I also found in writing about all of these different autobiographical works was that, comics is the art of reinvention, especially autobiographical comics. So in many ways, what these cartoonists were doing and drawing themselves over and over and focusing on this detail that they had been told culturally was, unassimilable, they would often start with the nose. They would start with that detail and work from there to really explore how do I see myself? How does the world see me? And how do I want to be seen? And so autobiographical comics were a way almost of creating a story of who they were. So this is just, I'm giving you lots of fun images. And, since this is a talk about comics, I want you to go away with lots of great long form comics that might be of interest. And these are just some of the works. This is Aileen Kaminsky-Crumb, who I just talked about before. And these are just some of the comics I wrote about in my book. And this is a cartoon. So I use the word cartoon when I'm talking about a single panel, because of course, when you're drawing just one panel, like a painting, it's very different from what comics is, which is also oftentimes called a sequential art. So when you're thinking about these boxes in sequence, it's very different from looking at a single panel. But I love this cartoon by cartoonist Liana Fink. It's from, I think you can find it on her Instagram page, and I would strongly suggest following her if you don't already, because she has these wonderful single comics that are really expressions of identity and grappling with many of the questions that I grappled with in a lot of my scholarship. But this image of me looking in the mirror at M and this question of what do I see and what is looking back at me is really, I found this image after I'd already published the book, but in many ways I find that it really speaks to what I was trying to discover in looking at all of these different books and in writing about the ways that these Jewish women were coming to terms with their Jewish identity. The way they see themselves and how that connects with or is actually disjointed from the ways other people see them individually and communally. So for those of you who don't know, and this is probably the first book you should go out and get if you are not acquainted with long form comics. This is Art Spiegelman's Mouse. It won the Pulitzer Prize in 1992. It's a book about the Holocaust. It's about his parents' experiences in the Holocaust. And this is actually just the cover of the second volume. You can now buy the collected volume. And it was in some ways difficult for him to publish at first because he uses this metaphor of mice, and I'm not going to go into Spiegelman's book, but what I want to say about Spiegelman's book was that it was in many ways a book that long form, both autobiographical and non-autobiographical cartoonists look to and are heavily influenced by. So it was a strong influence for me as a young woman who is the grandchild of Holocaust survivors, and later as a graduate student who decided that I wanted to delve into this new, quote unquote, not really new, as yet not fully explored comics art. And it's a very, very important book for a lot of these authors, in part because what it led them to realize was that comics can tell any kind of story. Comics is simply another way of telling stories, and it can tell a really painful story as much as it can tell a humorous story, which is what maybe people are more aware of. Okay, so Rutu Modan. Rutu Modan's an Israeli cartoonist. I would say she's one of the most, if not the most known, at least globally. And these are 4 of the books she's published. The most recent one is Tunnels, and it just came out about a month ago. I'll talk very briefly about Tunnels, but I'm going to focus on the property, because what I wanted to talk about today is this question of family secrets. And that's really the thing I think that connects the different works that I'll be talking about today. So this idea that in the works, in the stories that we look at in these graphic novels and later a graphic memoir, there are intergenerational secrets. There are things that are not being passed along between generations. There are things that are being withheld. And yet, in a way, The secrets are driving the story. And this is something that I want to show you a little bit about how comics can make these absences really felt on the page. And sometimes these absences are visually apparent. Sometimes it's in the tension between what's being said and what we see on the page. And sometimes it's about the layers of the story, right? Because in comics, of course, you can have word bubbles, which is speech. You can have narrative bubbles, which is some narrator telling you what's happening. And then you can have all different iterations of words and images on the page. The other thing I want you to really pay attention to as you watch is the different aesthetics. So you can see Rutu Modan's style, I think even just from the covers of her books. She's very well known for this beautiful, her dramatic style, angular shapes. Her coloring is really, really important to her work. Oh, I see I'm getting a little bit of sunshine. It's 1 o'clock here in Brooklyn, so I'll move a little bit so you don't get so much glare when you look at me. So more books. So you can see how beautiful her style is, and there's a kind of, in a way, you'll see a kind of flatness to the way that she draws. In other words, it's not really meant to be realistic, as you can see from the characters, but actually there are exaggerations and dramatizations that really work to help push the story along. Okay, so I want to actually start with an autobiographical comic, a little excerpt from an autobiographical comic from Rutu Modan, even though the majority of her work is fiction. And this is from actually a New York Times blog that you can actually still find it. The link is here. You can click on it and find it online. And in an interview, I recently interviewed Modan, and she talked about this blog, and she said, I was asked to write this blog for the New York Times. There was a lot of time pressure, and I don't work so well under time pressure for coming up with fictional stories. So I thought, I'll just write about autobiographical things. So that's why in this case, it's a kind of unusual thing for her, but she decided to write these autobiographical stories. So one really important thing to think about when you see these images, this is not how it appears on the blog. This is just for the sake of the PowerPoint, so I can talk you through the storyline and what I want to show you from these images. But like any good artist, Modan thinks about the modality in which she's presenting the work. So when she's publishing books, it's not that just that she's creating each page and thinking about what each page looks like. She's thinking about what each page is going to look like and the page it's going to be facing, right? Because it's not only that you're reading it page by page, you're actually looking at pages in relationship to one another. And so oftentimes what happens, and Nora Krug also does this really beautifully, is you end up comparing different pages to one another, right? So you end up looking at one image, but the image on the facing side of the page is informing your reading of that image. So here, this is actually, because it was made for a New York Times blog, it was made for people to scroll, right? Whether on their phone or on their computers. And you can see that from the long panel box here. And the way that it's actually on the screen is there's long narrative and it's chopped up by some images accompanying the prose. And so here I want to show you, because this really introduces two of the main characters that we'll see in the property, even though this is autobiographical. So we can think of this as Rutu Modan's avatar, right? It's her alter ego on the page and her grandmother. And this is an instance where her character, Modan, right, her autobiographical character, has taken her grandmother to the hair salon. By the way, they're in Israel, they're in Tel Aviv. She's taken her grandmother to get her hair done, and they're having a conversation. And what's really interesting about this conversation, you can see the intimacy between the two of them, right? You can see it in the way that she's supporting her grandmother, the way her grandmother's leaning on her. But there's also a sort of distance between them, between their experiences and between what they're able to share with each other, especially what the grandmother is able to convey to her granddaughter. And this is really something that comes up throughout the property. So here, I'll just read the prose so you can think of it in relation to the image that you're seeing. She leaned on me, the grandmother, treading slowly and carrying herself in a stately manner. It was all she could do to stop herself from waving at passersby like Queen Elizabeth. Grandma, I asked her, why don't you want me to go to Europe? So the young woman here has just told her grandmother she plans to go on a trip to Europe. Because you have to study. That's the most important thing. That's the grandmother. Then she suddenly stopped. I was a gifted child, a wunderkind, the smartest in school. The teachers were crazy for me. They adored me. She sighed. I wanted to go to university so much, but my father thought it wasn't suitable for girls. So here's a moment between grandmother and granddaughter where really they're both almost having different conversations, right? The granddaughter is talking to her grandmother about this trip that she wants to go on, and she doesn't quite have a sense of why her grandmother is opposed to it. And her grandmother's giving her some of the information about this past history of her not having the same opportunity. But it's almost like there's a haunting going on. And you can see in this image, actually, in a lighter coloring here, because Rutu Modan's very interested in using coloring to tell part of the story to help you distinguish sometimes between different time periods. You can see the specter of the grandmother as a young girl, right? And you can even see her posture. She's holding her books. She's looking forward. There's a kind of ambition. She's ready to move forward with her education. And we know that didn't happen. And yet there's so much that's not spoken here between grandmother and granddaughter, partly because it cannot be conveyed, partly because the grandmother is withholding. And there's a lot of withholding that goes on from both generations, from all sides, in Rutu Modan's books. So that autobiographical image, that autobiographical comic really forecasts what I want to show you in the property. So this is Rutu Modan's property. And I just found out just an hour before I am giving this talk that it's actually going to be a film. It's going to be made into a film. And actually Modan's sister, Dana Modan, very well known in Israel as an actress and a director, she's making this film and they're working on it right now, which is very exciting to me. So this is actually the epigraph from the book, from the property. With family, you don't have to tell the whole truth and it's not considered lying. This is a theme that comes up over and over again in Modan's works, and especially it really threads through the property. And it's this really interesting thing that there are secrets between family members. Oftentimes these secrets are there because family members feel like they're protecting each other. But in effect, what the secrets also end up doing is creating distance. So there's this kind of push and pull that happens in the secrecy between characters. And a lot of what happens in the property is these secrets are sort of told, but not directly. There's no directness that happens in this book. So I recently had the opportunity to interview Modan about her new book, Tunnels. And I actually wanted to take the opportunity to ask her, by the way, I included the link down here, because this interview just went up online with the Jewish Book Council. So if you're interested in Modan's work, especially her new book, Tunnels, you can check it out. But I asked her, I said, the plots of your books seem to revolve around secrets held within families. I loved her answer here. She said, it's a fact that in my family, we have this attitude. Something is a secret and we respect the secret. We're a very close family. And this is really intriguing to me, this idea that they're a very close family, even though their family is very much a family of secret holders. It sounds funny to say that because we don't speak about a lot of things, but I was always very connected. It's why I always wrote about families as part of my identity. I don't see myself as an individual, but always as part of a small group. Now, this is really interesting. She says at the same time, everybody in the family is very individualistic by nature. So maybe the secret is like your private thing, something that keeps you safe from the group. You have this spot that you don't share, and it limits how much the others can interfere in your life. I love this notion of family secrets, thinking of it in that way, because we often think about secrets held in families as this damaging thing, right? This distancing thing. But here, really, Modan is turning it around on its head and saying, in a way, what helps keep my family together are the secrets that individuals are able to keep from each other. Okay, so I'm going to now introduce you to some panels, some pages and some panels from the book, just to give you a little sense of the aesthetics and how Rutu Modan uses comics to tell stories. And like I said, the focus, the emphasis, what I want you to really look at is especially the ways that absences or silences or secrets are often conveyed through this really interesting language of images and words, comics. I found this beautiful quote from another interview with Modan where she says, life is unfairly linear. And, the context of the original quote, what she was talking about is how you don't have that history. You don't get to re-experience with your grandparents what they went through. You don't get to go through that. You don't even get to revisit your own history, you can only do it through memory. And in a sense, what comics allows artists to do is to play with that linearity, right? So we saw that in the other image that I just showed you, to play with the ways in which the past, the specter from the past, can always be present. And that really is what she does in these books, is she shows us how the past is always present in these individual lives. So the basic plot of the property, we have this granddaughter, Mika, this grandmother, Regina. Okay, I'm not giving anything away. Well, I will be giving things away that are given away at the beginning of the book. The book is highly enjoyable. I suggest you read it if you haven't already. I hope that these slides will only enhance your excitement and enjoyment of the book. So it's a grandmother and a granddaughter. They live in Israel. The grandmother left Warsaw. She was born in Warsaw, and she left in 1939, before the war. This is all really her granddaughter knows about her. And at this point, the grandmother's son, who is Mika's father, died just a few months before the plot begins. And they've decided to return to Warsaw, ostensibly because the grandmother wants to reclaim her parents' property. And of course, a lot of her family perished in the Holocaust after she had already moved away to Israel. So they've just arrived at the hotel in Warsaw. The granddaughter and the grandmother have this really interesting relationship. But from the beginning, what we find out is they both have very different ideas of why they're on this trip. The grandmother's actually on this trip because she has this secret history, which I'm going to tell you. But again, you know this early in the book, so it's not a spoiler that's going to ruin the book for you. Essentially, Mika's father, Regina's son, was actually a non-Jewish man in Poland that she fell in love with in her early 20s. Her parents didn't want the marriage to happen, so they sent her off to Israel. That's why she got sent off to Israel in 1939, and they married her off to a Jewish man, one of her father's, someone who worked for her father. And she had another child there with her Jewish husband, so that's who, Mika was ostensibly assumed was her father, or was her grandfather. But now now they're back in Warsaw, and the granddaughter thinks they're looking for the property, but the grandmother actually is interested in reconnecting with her former lover in order to tell him that their son, the son that he never met because she left when she was pregnant, has died. And so you can even see, so in comics, in English language comics, we read this way, right, from left to right, and usually up and down the page. But you can see how Modon plays with panel sizes to draw your attention, to create a kind of atmosphere. So larger panels are often atmospheric. They give you a sense of the vibe of the room. You're not just zeroing in on what the characters are saying. You're actually absorbing a whole little world here. And you can see Mika's asking this, nothing question, who recommended this hotel? They're having this side conversation, not an important conversation, but there's this silent panel in the middle, and it zeroes in on the grandmother's face. And you can see there's a moment here of silence, and you know that there's something that's being withheld here, right? This is the grandmother's world being conveyed here. And we can even see that Mika's back is turned in these panels. It's almost like we are being told Mika is now not fully part of whatever's going on in the grandmother's world. So that the visual images give us a sense of the other stories in the background. So I brought together different excerpts from the book. This is not how you would read the book, but I wanted to show you the beautiful things that Modon does with silent panels, how she tells stories, how she tells things about characters' relationships using sometimes just complete silence. And so these are all from different pages. This is a full page, but these are from different parts of the book. And I've just taken a row of panels from a different page. So this is when Mika and her grandmother, Regina, are at the airport. They're at security, and security has told her grandmother, you cannot bring that 2-liter bottle of water in with you. The grandmother's very upset. She says, take a sip. It's just water. Let me have it. I don't want to waste money. Something my grandmother actually would, I'm sure, do the same exact thing. I'm not sure. I probably would too. And the grandmother decides to guzzle the whole thing right then and there. much to the chagrin of the security guards and her granddaughter, who is both, you can sense her shame and her embarrassment, but you can also sense that she's there for her grandmother. And actually someone makes a quip about her grandmother, and the granddaughter quietly defends the grandmother at the end of the scene. But what I love about these 3 silent panels, notice it's the same gesture. We're not learning anything new when we look at these 3 panels. What are they doing there? Why do we have 3 panels? Well, in a sense, if you think about, there's a comics scholar, Scott McCloud, who's very well known. Actually, he's a cartoonist too, and he wrote a book about how comics work. And he talks about the different panels on the page as beats of time, like beats of music. And you can see how actually what's being conveyed here is the sense of time stretching, right? How long it's taking the grandmother. I mean, it would take any of us a long time to guzzle 2 liters of water, but also the sense of everyone waiting in the background, and also the granddaughter, right, who's standing there, oh, my grandmother's doing this. So you're really getting a sense not just of the grandmother's character here, but also the relationship between the 2. And she's doing this without any language, without any words. So I want to show you how she does this on the right in this full page. Another really powerful example of silence. Now, sometimes she has these tiny narrative boxes that usually give you a sense of time or place. So here it says, meanwhile, at the hotel. Here's Regina, the grandmother. She's about to go see that former lover. He doesn't know it, but she's about to go visit him. And she hasn't seen him in over 60 years, right? She's approaching 90, and she left in her early 20s, and she had his child, and he never met him. And all of this history is past. And here she is in the hotel. She's dressing herself. Now, notice the perspective we're getting as viewers, right? We see the bedspread. We see this kind of mess of the bedspread. This first panel is larger than the other panels. Again, it's giving us this sense of the atmosphere, the vibe, right? Think about how when you're feeling like chaos inside, oftentimes the room around you sort of absorbs that same feeling. And so every single piece of furniture, every single piece of clothing, the bedspread, they're all working together to contribute, to give the reader the sense of this internal chaos that the grandmother's experiencing. And then notice again, we read from left to right, up and down, but we don't exactly know how to read this, right? So our eyes probably wander back and forth. Again, these are silent panels. Nothing new is happening. It's just the grandmother glimpsing herself in the mirror from different angles, adjusting her earrings, adjusting her collar. But we still get this incredible sense of internal, what's happening inside, just from these silent panels. So just as our eyes are wandering back and forth, we can imagine the flutter going on inside of her, all of the things running through her mind, all of that past coming back. And then in this final panel, Modon's doing a lot to move us to the next scene. If you've ever studied fiction writing, you know how hard it is to move a character from one scene to the next. And in comics, there's some tricks you can use. So here we see Regina, we see this white purse, which is actually going to play an important part in the story. We see the open door of the cab, so we know she's about to go into it, and it says taxi here. So we're given these pieces of information. We could read every inch of the page to get a full sense of what's going on before her departure to go revisit this property she hasn't been to and this person she hasn't seen. And then finally, this is from later in the book, but again, I want to show you the silent panels. This is Roman, so the man that she will meet again, who she hasn't seen for years, and he's building a house of cards. Of course, it's a very obvious metaphor, but it's a very beautiful metaphor for this moment in the book. He's just seen Regina, and now all of these thoughts are coming back in his mind. So it's almost the reverse of this moment for her. He actually didn't have that moment of preparation. He didn't know she was coming. And here he is, and he's interrupted by this dialogue bubble by his daughter, who has no idea what's going on. And you can see that this house of cards is really about to come down, right? So again, it's this character who on the surface is really trying to keep it together, trying to stay composed. But the sense that we get in reading these silent images is that there's a lot going on under the surface. Okay, I'm going to show you a few more panels or a few more pages from Modon just to give you more of a sense of the aesthetics. So this is another silent page. Here, Mika is going into a cafe. I'm not going to explain who this character is because it's a whole other story, but she's hiding from him. And eventually what happens is she meets this non-Jewish tour guide right here in the cafe. And he plays a really important part in the story in helping her. In a sense, he helps her unravel her family secrets. And in a way, his character really represents this idea that sometimes you need to move away from the family. You need to find someone separate from the family to really get close to the hard things, right? The hardest things to talk about. And what's really beautiful about, so first you can notice in the middle panel here, the characters in the cafe are drawn in color. Again, Modan uses color. She mutes the background because she really wants to give you a sense of the sounds of a cafe, right? The cups, the spoons running around, the sort of background noise. And then also look at this final two panels. Mika's looking outdoors. She's focused on hiding. And here's this new character, Tomas, who's looking at her. In a way, these two panels symbolize what will become their relationship because he oftentimes knows things that she doesn't know. So you can even see she's hidden, right? You only see part of her face and you see his full face. So in a sense, he's able to fully see her even as, she still isn't fully available to see for herself. He's going to help her unpack those secrets, that family history. Now, I wanted to also show you how Modan uses these word boxes, these word bubbles that we see, of course, a lot in comics. And notice how she makes them almost all the same size. And it gives, again, because everything is almost flattened on the page, you can really look for details. You can look for visual cues that are helping you understand what's going on with the characters in the story. So here, Regina is seeing her former lover for the first time, Roman. And I'm going to keep lecturing and then we'll have time for questions after. And they're having this encounter and you can even see their body language in a way mirrors each other for a lot of these panels. But the granddaughter here has no idea what's happening between them, right? She has no idea who this woman is. She has no idea about this history. And you can see from the way that Modan draws the couple almost as a pair in these panels, she's giving us that information that they're withholding something, they're sharing something together here that the granddaughter's not aware of. And then here's a different page, but what I wanted to show you here was notice how Modan's taken out those lines around the panels, right? And in a sense, if you think back to that autobiographical comic where you have the ghostly grandmother, the young grandmother, it's a way of connecting the past and the present. Here too, it's a conversation between grandmother and granddaughter. The grandmother is saying, "Oh, I'm so glad you met this nice young man." But then suddenly she finds out the young man isn't Jewish and she shifts. The grandmother's attitude shifts. And she says, "A Polish man taking Jews around Warsaw?" And the granddaughter says, "Why not?" Then there's this silent panel where they're not understanding each other. And the grandmother says, "He probably just made that up." Right? And suddenly there's all of this past history that's coming up for Regina, but the granddaughter doesn't know about it. And in a sense, because you don't have those lines that are closing, that are framing those panels, in a sense, it gives the reader this feeling that we're connecting, this conversation is somehow connected to something outside of what's going on here, which of course it always is, right? There's always the specter of the past and it's always present in all these conversations between grandmother and granddaughter. Okay, I'm gonna show you one more image from Modan and then I'm gonna move to Nora Krug's book so you can see a radically different style. But this is a really beautiful page, I think. And this is the first time the grandmother Regina is going out to Warsaw. So it's her first drive. And notice also the other thing you can think about when you read comics is what perspective are you getting? If you just saw what was outside the window without seeing Regina's body here, then you'd be getting her direct perspective. But you're not getting that. You're almost getting the perspective of a passenger sitting next to her. In a sense, it's helping you more closely identify, at least in this situation, with the situation that the granddaughter would be in if she knew where her grandmother was. She has no idea where her grandmother was. So in a sense, as a reader, you're taking the place of where that granddaughter would be you are learning that history that the granddaughter hasn't been privy to. She'll only be privy to in little bits throughout the book. And the other thing happening here, you can see on the first two panels, Warsaw, as she passes it by, is in full color in the background. And then suddenly it's in black and white, right? Or it's in grayscale. And that's her remembering. That's her remembering the past and remembering what it used to look like. I think it's a really beautiful way of showing how the past lives on in the present for Regina, particularly in this revisiting to her past. And then, of course, the final panel, and Modan is so good at these final panels that sort of break the narrative. You have the cab driver interrupting this reverie that she's in, right? And you have this word bubble really stands out because it's the only language on the page. And you have her suddenly, she has to get back into the present. And so there's this constant tension between falling into the past, falling into where she was, and the present. Okay, actually, I lied. This is the one last page I want to show you because I love this page. Now, I think of the property at its heart as a book about grief. The granddaughter's just lost her father. The grandmother's just lost her son. And yet they can't talk to each other about it because of this secret between them. But in this final panel here, now in this scene, the grandmother's very depressed and the granddaughter doesn't know why. She thinks it has something to do with her father having just died, but there's something that she knows she doesn't know. And in this final panel here, which again, it doesn't have a framing around it, we see the two of them, and there's an intimacy here, right? Their bodies are touching, the blanket and the granddaughter's body, they're touching in space, and there's a kind of reverse mirroring. They're facing away from each other, but their postures are the same, and yet they're facing in completely different directions, and there's this isolation. And in a sense, for me, it really speaks to the experience of grief, how two people might be grieving the same person, but there's a sense in which you cannot share grief, right? Because your grief for whatever is lost, even if it's the same person, is different from the other person's grief. Not just because your relationship is different, your experiences with that person is different, but also because of these other histories, these other stories that are connected to that story of grief. So in the grandmother's case, this whole lost past, right? It's not just that she's lost her son, she's lost this whole potential past with this man she was once in love with, whose baby she was carrying. So there's so much going on that page in that panel. Okay, now I'm going to a little bit rush through Nora Krug's incredible book, but I want you to see a little bit of a difference in how the aesthetics work in Nora Krug's Belonging. So Nora Krug she lives in America now, but she was born in Germany, and she's not Jewish, but she married a Jewish man in the US, and she lives here now. And Belonging, which in its original German was titled Heimat. So it's not an exact translation, but you know, when you're titling books in English, you have to come up with the one word to match, and the idiom doesn't always match. But Belonging was translated into English here, or actually it's in, I think she wrote it in both languages. I don't think she used a translator. But we're going to talk a little bit about how different this book is. So if Rutu Modan's book, it's fictional, it's very conventional in the sense of its use of comics and panels and those panels in a row to tell stories. Krug's book is completely different. I would actually call it a visual memoir because she actually combines photographs, a whole archive. And really what Krug's book is she doesn't know her grandparents' role, her German grandparents' role in the war, in the Holocaust, and she wants to know. She doesn't know this family history. Essentially, her parents didn't talk about what her grandparents were doing during the war, and the book is really an exploration to find out what happened. And so a lot of it, again, is based around these absences, these things that she doesn't know, these things that she wasn't told. And she has a definition of Heimat, a dictionary definition, which I think really speaks to what she's trying to do in this book, which is trying to find a sense of belonging, of home. So the definition written here, I'll just read a little tidbit. That term, which defines the concept of an imaginarily developed or actual landscape or location with which a person associates an immediate sense of familiarity. This experience is imparted across generations. That's really important. So Krug's book, she writes about growing up as a German, learning the history of what happened in her country in school, but nobody talking at home about what happened or about how her family members were involved. And she talks a lot about how she was raised almost with no sense of belonging to Germany because she was told she shouldn't belong, right? And it's this really compelling narrative where she's trying to figure out, well, where do I belong? Should I have a place where I belong? Is Heimat something? It's a search. It's really a search. And in the end, the answer is complicated. Does she find Heimat? Does she not find Heimat? But I would say the closest thing to Heimat for her is really in this search to find out the truth behind her family's history. So you can see this motif. You could see in the cover of the book and throughout the book, there are nods to the very famous German romantic artist Caspar David Friedrich's very famous painting, Wander Above the Sea of Fog. And she puts herself, of course, in a very different way. She's looking out into a landscape. And again, it's this question of how do I connect with these German things, these beautiful things that I take from the culture when there are all these ugly things there that are really front and center of her relationship to being a German. And she writes this book after 12 years of living in America. She says, I feel more German than ever before. It's a book she writes after coming to America and finally realizing that she has this really complicated relationship to herself as a German, to her German identity. This is something you actually find in a lot of narratives of immigration. There's a sense in which once you leave home or the place that you come from, suddenly that's when you start to understand with distance, oh, I have to figure out my relationship. I don't fully understand who I am. And that's what happens for Krug in her book. So aesthetically, you can see how different she composes this book. So Krug is also a teacher like Rutu Modan. Modan teaches at Bezalel. Krug teaches at Parsons. She actually teaches design, but she includes some comics, and you can see how differently they are, how different her aesthetic is, and even the coloring. And she essentially uses comics to break up the story when she's either remembering her own personal history. So this is a memory, her own memory of visiting the cemetery of her uncle, who was actually a Nazi youth who died before her father was born and who her father was named after. So she uses comics either to recall her own memories or to reconvey the story that she's told about her family history, right? So to tell other people's stories. But what she does is she includes then photographs from her own childhood. Everything is annotated in Krug's book. And Krug has talked about her book as a diary. And everything is, it's told to you directly how she wants you to read everything. And so this is a photograph of her and her mother in their backyard in 1980. And she remembers the planes flying over, the US military planes flying over her house, and how there's this thing looming over her that she is trying to understand here. She's trying to really unpack. Part of me understood that something had once gone horribly wrong. So in an interesting way, I often think about comics as annotated photo albums. In a way, I mean, we don't have photo albums anymore in the way that we once did, but those of us who have our photo albums with our, print photographs, remember that sharing a photo album or even just looking at it for ourselves, it was often about the story you told around those photos, right? And in a way, that's what Krug is doing here. She's taking those family photos and she's also finding other parts of her family archives. So she finds documents from her uncle's early childhood education. She finds all of these documents to help her figure out her past. And she's really trying to repiece the story. In a way, she's forming a new family album. But this family album doesn't just tell those happy stories that family albums very often focus on, not always, but often, right? As I like to say to my students, we don't usually have a picture of divorce in our family albums, although I understand now that it's a very popular genre on Instagram, the divorce photo. But very often when we capture photos in family albums, we capture those quote unquote happy moments, or those moments that are meant to remind us of childhood spaces or childhood relationships. And Krug is really playing with this, and she's really trying to figure out, how does this individual history, her individual history, connect to this larger story. And it's a story with many secrets, just like in Modin's work. Okay, so I'm going to just show you some of these images. I included so many images, but I feel I've talked enough at you, and I would love to hear some of your questions. On the right here is an excerpt of an interview I recently did with Nora Krug on her book. It was for a special issue of Literature and Belief edited by a scholar, Victoria Ahrens. And so you can see some of the different things that she includes in the book. She includes these objects, these German objects that remind her of her past. In order to really think about that past history, she has a nostalgia for certain items, just as we all do for items of her childhood. But she's really trying to figure out, what do these different things represent? What does my German identity represent for me? I'm gonna scroll ahead a little bit. So these are pages from her childhood, her 11th grade exercise book. This is a speech by Hitler that students were told to annotate. I wish that I could give an assignment like this, taking a political speech and breaking down the rhetoric piece by piece, line by line, word by word. It's a really incredible. So she includes all of these incredible moments of her own personal history and her own family history. And then, of course, she describes in her own annotations, she designs a whole story, a search behind them. She also has, this is actually a 2-page spread from her book. She goes into antique stores and finds like objects, anonymous objects. So she finds photographs of Germans in the countryside. And it's so interesting what she's trying to do here. She's really trying to figure out, like, what's the story? What's the world that I grew up in? Who are these people? Who am I in relation to these people? So here are all of these Germans in forests. And of course, the forest for a lot of Germans is this really important connection to homeland, but it's also got a very terrible, dark history in relation to the Holocaust. So it's all of these pieces that she's trying to put together of both an individual history and this communal history. This is an image of her grandfather from the beginning of the book when she knows nothing about him. So you can see how she's, superimposing her own writing over his face. Here he is at the end. She eventually discovers, this is another spoiler, but again, it doesn't really spoil the book. She finds out he was determined a follower. There were different categories by law. The Allies interviewed all Germans and made them answer a questionnaire. And he was found to be a follower, which was sort of a middle category in the spectrum of like how guilty you were. And in a way, okay, she can see his full face now, but she knows she feels still such a distance between what she knows about him. And again, another image of a relative who's not there. And this question, who would we be as a family if the war had never happened? And, Amy Kurzweil, whose book I'm not going to talk about today, Flying Couch, she wrote a review of Nora Krug's book. And she said that reading Belonging, this is a quote from her, was like reading my own history's shadow. I thought that was such a beautiful quote. I felt the same thing reading Nora Krug's book. As the granddaughter of Holocaust survivors, I thought, it would have been really helpful to have this book when I was a child to understand that it wasn't just my, I don't want to say side because that's so simplistic, but it wasn't just as the daughter of a survivor. It wasn't just me who was impacted or this generation or, there are all these interconnected stories. It would have been helpful to have sort of a broader way of understanding events and understanding the intergenerational impact of events. So I'm just going through, you can see Amy Kurzweil's style. This is Miriam Caton, Letting It Go. She's a child Holocaust survivor. Beautiful book. She has 2 sets of memoirs. This is her second one. And then I end with, just in case anyone's looking for good long form comics, I'm just putting this page up for you all to look at. And I do have a web page in case anyone's interested. You can check out, I have a lot of educational resources and I do a lot of interviews and reviews. So you can also look there if you're interested in thinking more about comics and Jewish comics. So I will stop there. Take a sip of my coffee.
Thank you very much, Tahneer, for your really wonderful lecture. And let me start with reading comments, at least one comment which is really beautiful, and I would like to share with everyone. And by the way, we have just meanwhile a few questions. So when whoever would like to ask, please raise your hand, and I will allow you to speak, or just send your question through the chat. So first of all, a comment from Sarah. Dr. Oksman, I love that you are elevating Jewish female visibility through your scholarship and for helping me further appreciate the power of graphic novels and memoir. They are like plays, great words and performance, or song, great words and music. And so really, it's really moving a comment. And Sarah also asks, I love your choice of authors. How made you opt not to cover Ross' chest? Is she too done already? Also, what can be done about Google image results when we Google a word Jew? Practically all of them are pictures of men. Do books like yours offer a solution to the invisibility? So this is the first question, which I also send you through the direct chat. So.
Oh, great. Okay, so two questions. You know, there's nothing we can do about Google, or that's a whole other question. But I see what you're saying, this question of, you know, how do we make Jewish women's work visible? And, you know, oftentimes I think about my line of work, what it is that I do as a scholar, because of course, you know, I grew up thinking as a feminist, I really wanted to change the world. And I do think in some ways, I do think of reviewing and writing about Jewish women's work as my form of activism. In other words, I try to review books that, you know, a lot of them are well-known people like Rutu Modan or Roz Chast, who I'll talk about in a second, who they certainly get coverage, but I don't know if they get as much coverage as they should get. You think about, you know, how much coverage some canonical male cartoonists get. So I do think of interviewing and just giving my attention to these works as a really important, whatever form of activism that I can give back. Of course, I can never cover all of the books that I want to cover. There's so much out there. So maybe there are people out there willing to write about or think about or just read some of these books, because I do think it's important to have different perspectives, and not just perspectives in terms of content, but also aesthetic perspectives, right? You can see the ways that so many, this is sort of one of the thesis, if you had to say my central argument in my book, is that a lot of these Jewish women authors, they really play with form in interesting ways as part of their projects. Now, why didn't I talk about Roz Chast today? I talk about Roz Chast a lot. I love Roz Chast's book. If those of you who don't know, Can't We Talk About Something More Pleasant is a brilliant memoir. And I am actually writing about it right now. I'm writing an article on it. So there's only so much I could do in each talk, but I love Roz Chast's work. If you're interested in it, it's a book. And again, it's really, I think of it as a hybrid book. There's comics there, but there's also cartoons. If you know Roz Chast, the New Yorker cartoonist, you can really see her sort of dark humor in this book. That's about a very serious topic. It's about her parents caregiving for her elderly parents in their final years and the final days of their lives, and what that experience was like for her, and then a little bit of the aftermath. It's an incredible book, and I very strongly would recommend it to everyone.
Lovely. Thank you for this answer. Another question from Sandy this time. Would you consider Lily Renee to be a long-form comic artist or writer?
You know, I'm trying to remember. I only know the biography. I've read the biography about Lily Renee by Trina Robbins, but I don't know enough about Lily Renee's. I haven't seen enough of the original works to know if I would consider it long form. I mean, long form generally, I think about, so Art Spiegelman very famously, when he published Mouse, he said he wanted a book that you could put a bookmark in. So, for him, it ended up being very long. It's in 2 volumes, although it was initially published serially in shorter pieces, and even some excerpts were published earlier. And so, the word long form, I mean, you could think of it as applying to full-length books, but that's how I tend to think of it. But there's really no exact number of pages for what makes something long form. How it's published can be really important. So if something's published in a newspaper or online, oftentimes they tend to be shorter in the interest of space, although there's a lot of examples of longer online comics where you just click through pages. So I don't have an exact number for what long form is, but what I tend to do is I tend to teach books, because I like having an object that my class can sort of sit around, and all of us can be, when we're in person, can be holding a book together and thinking about it, not just in terms of storyline, but almost as an object that we're sharing. So I don't really let students buy ebooks when I'm teaching books, but I love teaching them alongside shorter works like the Rutumudon blog, because I think you can really learn a lot about form. And I don't necessarily think great literature means longer literature, which I know that there are some critics who feel that way, but I think you can do, as Grace Paley shows us in her short stories, you can do brilliant things. You can spin and weave brilliant tales in just a couple of pages.
Great, thank you. Another question from Aviva. Do you think Holocaust comics lessen the historical gravity, meaning sanitize the horror?
That's a really interesting question. I don't, and I don't think I would write about or think about these books if I thought so. I think there's a lot of notions about comics that tend to be false. And I think for good reason. The comics that people tend to know about are superhero comics, they're mainstream comics. And so even though they're very important to many people, those, superhero or action comics or romance comics, we tend to think of those genre comics when we think about comics. But actually, I see comics as just another way of telling stories. I think the word comics is a misnomer there, and that's why I tend to use phrases like graphic memoir, graphic narrative, although it's sort of complicated, all those different words. But I don't think there's anything comedic about looking at words and images. And in fact, one thing I've been thinking about a lot lately is how in this world we live in today, everything we look at practically online, there's images and words together. And so there's a real power in thinking about reading the world in this way and in transmitting stories in this way. And I think anyone who's read, I just reread The Property last night in preparation for the talk. And even though it's not a Holocaust book, because Regina moves to Poland in 1939, but of course there's the specter of the Holocaust. I was in tears by the end of the book, and I don't cry easily. And so, no, I don't think it lessens the impact at all. I think it gives you a new way of thinking about certain things, like the relationship between the past and the present, or certainly there's a lot of interesting conversations to be had around choices that artists make when they're conveying, when they're representing different experiences. There's lots of right and wrong and good, and I don't want to say right and wrong, but there's better ways to do it, and there's, not so good ways to do it. But I would never say that it lessens or sanitizes the horror. I think actually what many of these books do is give you the full impact of some of these stories.
Yes, indeed. I'm personally agreeing with this comment. Okay, another question from Caroline. Does any of these books is available online? The ones you presented?
Online, you would have to purchase them. You mean ebooks?
I guess.
I'm not sure if you mean, so a lot of comics are available as ebooks, and there are plenty of people who like to read their comics online. And there's great apps for reading online. So yes, you can purchase a lot of these books online. You could purchase my book online as an ebook. I think that's what's being asked. So yes.
Yeah, I think at least Route to Modern is available on Amazon for sure. If somebody...
Yeah, I hate plugging that website, but yes, there's a lot of really good independent book websites where you can purchase books from. But yes, available for purchase through online sites for sure. Absolutely. Through that big website and other websites as well. And yes to Guerrilla Girls for Women Cartoonists, Virginia. Thanks for that.
Lovely comment. Okay, another question from Erga Heller. Do you see Holocaust or World War II comics, graphic novels as a genre for itself?
Erga, that's such a great question. Questions of categorization have entranced me from the very beginning of writing about comics, thinking about categories of literature, for example, what makes something Jewish literature, even what makes something comics, because you could see the Nora Krug, it's not all comics, right? Which is why I think of it as visual memoir. On the other hand, I think categories are helpful to a point. So in terms of genre, genres can be really helpful if, for example, right now I'm writing a book about grief memoirs. So I'm trying to find all of these memoirs that are about the experience of grief. So I'm having to parse out books that are about, the aftermath of grief versus books that are about caretaking. And that can be really interesting because once you parse those things out, you can see, okay, here are the trends in terms of how people write after the person has died. Here are the trends in terms of how people write, what they focus on when they're in the middle of caretaking. So genres can be very useful for those purposes. I'm sort of answering your question in a weird way, but in terms of Holocaust, World War II graphic novels, there's enough that certainly they could form a genre, but there are differences too, right? So you have Amy Kurzweil's memoir, for example, is an intergenerational story, and she does have her grandmother's oral history, but she also really inserts herself and her mother's story into the narrative. So it's actually 3 generations, as opposed to Spiegelman, for example, Mouse, where there's 2 generations. There's lots of examples like this. So the emphasis is maybe a little bit different. So we could start parsing out subgenres. But I know Victoria Ahrens has a whole book on Holocaust comics. So you might want to check that out if you're interested in thinking about questions of genre. But certainly there are enough books that we could think about a genre or maybe some subgenres of, comics related to the Holocaust, long form.
Lovely. There were a few comments as well, and I sent you so you can read.
A question about my website. So I can be contacted through my website. I don't know if it's showing to everyone or just it says to host and panelists. So maybe, here we go.
This is to everyone.
So you can certainly contact me through my website. There's a contact link.
Lovely. Now I will unmute you so we will be able to say hello and thank you to Tarina.
Thanks so much. This was really interesting.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Very inspiring. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. I've never considered reading this field as that much, and now I'm going to.
Yay!
I made a couple notes in my book.
Great. I love that.
As always, thank you very much. Thank you.
Yes, thank you for all the information. It's really interesting. Thank you.
Lovely. Thank you very much to Tahneer Oksman, our today's lecturer, and to all of you from all around the world. Hope you enjoyed, and see you in a week. Good night and goodbye.
Good night. Goodbye.
Thank you.
Good night. Thank you.